Hello, my name is William Sia. I'm a senior at Ladue Horton Watkins High School, and today I'll be talking about policy debate jargon. So this isn't really much of a lecture, and as a more so of a dictionary. Basically, I'm going to give you a list of terms that are pretty common and kind of jargony in policy debate, and we'll be going over a brief description of each of them. There's a lot of terms, so I'll try and keep the descriptions brief, but hopefully this will help you understand not only the other lectures in this lecture series, but also useful for you as you debate throughout your high school and potentially even college debate careers. So let's start. So let's start on the stock issues. So this is a specific model of policy debate where the affirmative team has to basically prove five things, and those are the five things listed here. So let's go through each of them really briefly. So first is inherency. Inherency answers the question: is the problem that the affirmative team is trying to solve going to solve itself right now or in our current world, the status quo? Well, if the answer is no, the affirmative is automatically lost inherency. But basically, the affirmative team is trying to prove that whatever plan that whatever action they're trying to take, whatever problem they're attempting to solve, isn't going to solve itself right now for one or a multitude of reasons, and that would be inherency. The second thing here is solvency. So solvency, in policy debate, the affirmative team is proposing a policy which they believe should be put into law. And basically, solvency asks the question of the affirmative team: does your policy really do what you're going to say it does, which is solve for some of the harms, create some benefits? Does it really do good in this world in solving your harms and creating significance? Well, that's the question posed by solvency. The third thing here is harms. So harms and significance, the fourth thing here, are sort of tied together in that they're both considered impacts. They're good things that the affirmative team is going to claim that they do. The difference is that harms are reduced, whereas significance is increased, right? So harms would be something like poverty, which is existing now, is pretty bad. And the affirmative team would say, oh, well, our policy proposal reduces poverty, and that's a good thing. So they're addressing their harms, which is poverty. Significance is something that some benefit that the plan creates. So as opposed to reducing an existing harm, the plan could say spur economic growth. Well, that would be a creation uniquely tied to the plan. It's a significant benefit. It's a significant reason why the plan is good. And you can see the difference there. As opposed to reducing something that exists, it creates something good for the world after we pass the policy. The final stock issue is topicality. Basically, this issue deals with whether or not the affirmative team's policy proposal falls in line with the rules of debate, the resolution, if you will, that NSDA sets for us every single year. So now let's talk about some terms that you'll see when you're on the affirmative side. So the first thing is the plan. And the plan, as we've talked about extensively, is what the entire affirmative team's strategy is going to revolve around, because their job in the debate is to propose a policy, which is their plan. So the next three terms are to ensure that the debate is not about the implementation of the plan, is not about the implementation of the plan, but rather the impacts of the plan. So fiat basically says when you vote AF, or even neg, because fiat can happen on counterplans for the negative team. The action that the judge votes for goes into place immediately, and well, not immediately, but it goes into place with certainty, so it will become law. Regardless of the process that happens, it's the easiest way that action or that law or that policy becomes codified in United States law. This is important because it ensures that we're not having a long drawn out debate about the implementation of the plan, and instead we're talking about the effects of the plan, because we're just skipping past the entire implementation part altogether with fiat. Next is normal means. Normal means is basically the idea that when the affirmative team's plan or when the counter plan goes into law, it also goes into law with proper enforcement, proper funds to actually enforce those, proper implementation as the team who proposes the plan intends for it to be implemented, etc., etc., etc. This ensures that there's no arguments about like circumvention, where you could say like a president doesn't agree with your policy, so they just choose to never enforce it. That basically removes that issue. So normal means says all of those are gone. We're not talking about the implementation process. Let's focus on more important things like the actual real world consequences of such a policy. The final thing is the right to clarify. Obviously, you don't want the affirmative team spending the 8 minutes of their first speech going through every minute detail about the implementation of their plan. So instead, they talk about the impacts and propose their plan those 8 minutes, but as a result, there can be some vagueness or ambiguity when it comes to what the plan actually does. So in those instances, it's important for the affirmative team to have the right to clarify, so they can clarify what it is exactly, what are those small details that they couldn't get to in their first speech that may be important for the round. The final two terms here are two types of AFs, probably the most common AFs you'll see in eastern Missouri. The first is the big stick AF. The big stick AF is basically big impacts. You think of things like nuclear war, economic growth, global warming and climate change, all of those things that affect a lot of people. And AFs, policy proposals, which go all the way there, basically talk about those big impacts. That's in stark contrast to the soft left AF, which more tends to talk about more smaller impacts in terms of the number of people they affect, but they argue that they could be equally or more important. So, for example, an impact like poverty, which affects a marginalized community, maybe the soft left AF is going to argue that poverty is important because these people are marginalized and poverty is always ignored in favor of big stick impacts like climate change or global warming, or climate change or nuclear war. Oftentimes, soft left AFs will have framing with them, and we'll touch on that later when we talk about impact calculus. So now let's move to the crux of policy debate, which is causes and effects. As I mentioned earlier, the right to clarify, normal means, and fiat, all of those are in place and allowed to ensure that we're talking about causes and effects. And the way we present those in policy debate is through advantages and disadvantages. Advantages are good things caused by the plan. Disadvantages are bad things caused by the plan. They both follow the same structure: uniqueness, link, internal link, and impact. So uniqueness refers to a description of the status quo. It's basically it's a piece of evidence which talks about something in the status quo that will change after the plan. And that leads us to the second part of the advantage and disadvantage, the link. So this is important because it takes the plan in question, the policy in question, and specifically links it. It specifically describes the cause and effect that happens as a result of the plan, either a good thing or a bad thing, depending on whether it's an advantage or a disadvantage. The internal link is like the link, except instead of linking the policy and some effect, it links the effect described in the link to a bigger impact. We're expanding the scope of our impact, the number of people affected, through the internal link. And that leads us to the terminal impact, which is the final impact that we're going to talk about in a policy round, and what we think the judge should be weighing in the round. So, for example, terminal impacts would be like nuclear war or climate change, things that you can't really get much bigger than that we are going to stress are important, or even poverty. So speaking of impacts, let's talk quickly about impact calculus. Impact calculus is basically how we argue that different types of impacts should be weighed. So if we had a debate with a disadvantage that led to climate change and an advantage that led to reducing the probability of nuclear war, well, how do we decide which of these are important? In a vacuum, both of these things are certainly important, but at the end of the day, we have to make a decision, one over the other. Impact calculus aims to help us determine that. So here's some terms that are going to be really common for impact calculus. The first is the turn. The turn basically takes one impact, turns it to your side, or turns it to the other side. So for example, in our scenario about nuclear war, if the affirmative team says we're going to reduce the probability of nuclear war happening, but the negative team reads evidence that says actually their policy increases the chance of nuclear war happening, in that sense there is a turn. They're directly taking the impact that the affirmative team describes, turning it on its head, and suddenly it's no longer a good thing, but now it's a bad thing. So that's the turn. It works the same way the other way around as well. The next three terms are the principal ways that we sort of compare impacts. The first is magnitude. How many lives are we affecting? So climate change affects a lot of people. Poverty only affects a certain community of people. In that sense, numerically at least, the magnitude of climate change is higher, therefore we should prefer it. Next is probability. Probability is how likely is your impact going to happen. We're talking about nuclear war versus climate change. Climate change is extremely probable because we're already seeing its impacts now. A lot of credible scientists say it's coming and it may be too late to stop it. As opposed to nuclear war, we've never seen a nuclear war happen, and most strategists and international relations people and experts tend to agree that nuclear war is not a very high possibility. So in that case, because climate change is more probable than nuclear war, we prefer climate change because we want to deal with what's more likely to happen as opposed to what's less likely to happen. The final comparator we have is time frame that asks the question, how soon are we going to see these impacts? So for example, climate change is something that we are experiencing now, but we haven't experienced the worst yet. And the worst is yet to come, and it will probably take a few years or even decades before we even see that. Compare that with something like poverty. Poverty is happening now. We can see its effects every single day. It is at its worst right now. So the impact of poverty is really soon. It's right now. But climate change is yet to come. So in that case, we prefer poverty from a time frame perspective because it's happening sooner. The final three terms here are usually specific to when you're debating soft left halves. They often have something called framing, which basically takes what we typically think magnitude, probability, time frame, turns that on its head. And it says the actions we take shouldn't be evaluated by its consequences, but rather how moral are we being? Is it moral to ignore the suffering of those in poverty for the sake of a minuscule reduction in the probability of a nuclear war breaking out maybe several thousand miles away from our country? So in that instance, we're using deontological logic. So deontology is this idea that we should be prioritizing the moral intent of our actions over the actual consequences of our actions. Now, consequentialism, as the name implies, is kind of the direct opposite. It says that rather than determine what is morally best, or even if we're being morally dubious, because this action that we're taking results in the best possible set of consequences, in terms of maybe the number of lives, it is better to evaluate things by their consequences as opposed to their moral intent. So now let's talk about some of the terms you'll encounter while you're the negative. So one of the more complicated arguments in the negative arsenal is the counterplan. So the counterplan is basically a proposal by the negative team for some better way that they say is going to solve the affirmative team's harms or their significance or produce the benefits of the affirmative plan, but in a slightly better way. So that is essentially what counterplans are. So some terms to know for counterplans. The first is the net benefit. So as I mentioned earlier, the negative team doesn't propose a counterplan for no reason. They propose a counterplan because they think it's going to be better than the affirmative plan. Well, the reason why that counterplan is better than the affirmative plan is the net benefit. So for example, this could be a disadvantage that the negative counterplan avoids. Or maybe it's some internal net benefit, some benefit that the counterplan uniquely creates that the affirmative plan doesn't. In both of those instances, those are reasons why the counterplan is better than the affirmative plan. Those are net benefits. The next term is status. Status is basically what is the role of the counterplan in the debate? What role does it play in the negative strategy? We'll talk about this more when we touch on theory. The final four terms I have are four types of counterplans. These are the principal four that you'll probably encounter. So the first is the advantage counterplan. It aims to solve one advantage of an affirmative team's plan. So maybe an affirmative team has multiple advantages. They talk about both nuclear war and climate change. Well, an advantage counterplan would pick one of those impacts, either nuclear war or climate change, and propose an alternative method to solve only one. So basically it deals with one advantage. The actor counterplan is pretty much taking the affirmative plan and changing who implements that plan. So for example, this year, one of the hot topics is mandatory minimums and ending them. So a lot of affirmative teams say that Congress should be ending mandatory minimums. A negative counterplan, that's an actor counterplan, would be the Supreme Court ends them instead. So those types of counterplans, they do the same thing, end mandatory minimums, but the people who are implementing that are slightly different. It's the legislative branch versus the judicial branch of government. The third type of counterplan, this is sort of illegitimate, it's kind of unfair. It's the delay counterplan. Basically, it says the affirmative team isn't allowed to add a delay to their plan. So we'll just take your entire plan and we'll add a delay. We'll say, wait until this specific event is over, and then we can pass the affirmative plan. You can see why that's a bit unfair. The final counterplan type is the process counterplan. It basically adds a procedural component to the counterplan. So an example of a process counterplan would be the consult counterplan. Let's say we're talking about something that could have an impact on like native reservations, right? In those cases, it would probably be a good idea to consult with Native American tribes to ensure that they are on board with the plan. So a negative team would propose a consult counterplan where we consult with Native Americans. That consultation is a process that isn't part of the original plan, so in that sense, it is a process counterplan. So more terminology for counterplans. We're talking about permutation specifically. So let's start by defining what a permutation is. It's a test of competition. It looks at the opportunity costs, if you know economics. It looks at the opportunity costs of the affirmative plan. So it asks the question, is it possible, it asks the question, does the affirmative team's policy proposal, when passed, detract from the ability for the negative counterplan to also be put in place? So, a lot of the common perms, perm do both, perm do the plan, then the counterplan, perm do the counterplan as the plan. All of those deal with whether or not the counterplan itself is impossible to do if we pass the plan. That's basically testing for competition. If the affirmative plan leads to some consequence or some rule of law that would inhibit the ability for the negative team's counterplan to be put in place, to be put into law, then it's considered competitive and mutually exclusive. If not, then it's not competitive, and there's no reason to not pass the affirmative plan, because passing the affirmative plan doesn't interfere with the ability for the negative team to also do whatever they're advocating for. So some terms that are important for permutations. First is severance. Severance is a type of illegitimate perm where the affirmative team does, for example, they perm the counterplan and the affirmative plan, but instead of doing all of the original plan that the affirmative team proposes, they cut out part of it, right? And if they cut out part of that plan, then that's considered a severance perm, because they're basically taking part of their original advocacy as the affirmative team and removing it. And that can be seen as unfair because suddenly we're changing what exactly we're debating at hand. Next is the intrinsic perm. The intrinsic perm is another type of illegitimate perm where the affirmative team tests the competition of the affirmative plan and the negative counterplan, and it says it's possible to have both in the same world as long as we do this third thing outside of the plan and the counterplan. Introducing that element is sort of adding to your own advocacy, and similar to how severance is detracting from your own advocacy, intrinsic perms are theoretically illegitimate because they add stuff that was never mentioned in the debate. The next term here is competition. As I explained earlier, competition is whether or not a plan is actually mutually exclusive with the counterplan. There are two main types of competition, or reasons as to why, for example, a counterplan would not be possible in the world of the plan. The first is textual competition. Basically, this type of competition says that because the text of the counterplan is different, it's not the same plan, and therefore we can't. They're different things, right? The counterplan and the plan are different, so they're because of how it's worded. So therefore, they're different things. The next type of competition is functional. This is a bit more obvious. It's basically two different actions. So say ending mandatory minimums and ending 3 strike laws. That's ending 2 different types of laws. So functionally, those two advocacies are very, very different. Now let's talk a bit about topicality, which is another negative tool. So there's a lot of terms here, but basically the biggest thing to know is the structure of topicality. It works similar to an advantage. So first, it's important to know what a resolution is. A resolution is the topic that we're given at the beginning of every single year. It's what affirmative teams should make their plans within. So for example, if the topic is about criminal justice reform, the affirmative team should be proposing a policy about criminal justice reform. just as a basic example. So the way topicality works is we have an interpretation, violation, standards, and then impacts. So the interpretation takes a word in our resolution, which is normally a sentence about what type of area, what type of policy areas the affirmative team should be debating about. So the interpretation basically takes one of those words, defines it, and says, here's our interpretation of the resolution. The violation is sort of similar to the link in that it shows where the affirmative team doesn't meet your interpretation of the resolution. Next would be standards, which are like internal links. There are reasons why the affirmative team not meeting our interpretation of the resolution is bad for debate. And then finally, the impact, which is usually fairness or education. It deals with why are things like lack of fairness, lack of educational value, why are these things bad? The terminal impact for topicality. So the next 5 terms on the slide, the last 5 terms here, these are just examples of some types of standards. So limits would be is a pretty common standard. It basically says our interpretation is good because it limits the number of possible affirmative plans, which is helpful for the negative team, because we shouldn't be forced to prepare for every single possible policy or every single possible policy proposal that's out there. Ground would argue on a similar vein that there is set literature, right? There's set arguments that should be only for the negative team and set arguments that should only be for the affirmative team. Ground argues that if the affirmative team doesn't have to meet our interpretation, they don't have to meet the resolution, well, then the lines are blurred. What's negative argument and what's aff argument? It becomes murky. Brightline is sort of along the similar lines of limits and ground in that it's talking about how our interpretation is good because it sets a clear boundary for what is what is allowed under the resolution and what isn't allowed under the resolution. The next term, normative. Normative talks about what the interpretation is. So a normative definition would basically talk about how a word or a term in the resolution is used in everyday life. As opposed to intent to define, like a dictionary, it takes a single term and rather than giving all the context about the term, how do we normally use it, like in everyday life, it gives the cold vacuum definition of a word, and that's its intent to define. So next let's talk about some terms you'll find in theory. So the first 3 are things that relate to the status of a counterplan. So we have conditional, unconditional, and dispositional. So when you're asked what's the status of your counterplan, you're basically being asked when can you kick the counterplan? When can you drop the counterplan, stop advocating for it as the negative team? Conditional says we can do it, we can stop advocating for it whenever we want. This is the most common one. It's the most widely accepted interpretation and status. But in theory, there are debates about whether or not the negative team being allowed to drop their advocacy whenever they want is necessarily a good thing in terms of fairness and educational value for debate. Unconditional is the complete opposite. The negative team says we're never allowed to kick out of our advocacy. We're never allowed to stop advocating for our counterplan. We'll extend it to the end of the debate. We'll defend it to the end of the debate. Dispositional is a bit weird. It's this weird middle ground in that the negative team is only allowed to stop defending their counterplan if the affirmative team does a specific set of actions. So for example, if the affirmative team reads a permutation on their counterplan, the negative team would then be allowed to stop defending their counterplan. It's a bit weird and it's a bit murky, but basically there are certain conditions that have to be met in the round before the negative team can stop defending their counterplan. The last 2 terms I have on here are standards. So theory, as I talked about in my theory lecture, is very similar to topicality in that we also have standards. 2 of the more common standards would be clash and reciprocity. So clash is this idea that like 2 teams, when they're debating an issue, they should have arguments back and forth, right? One team should never find themselves in a situation where they have nothing to say because they were unprepared, right? In that case, we have a lack of clash. There is no clash. There's no crossing of swords. There's no feedback loop where one team is saying something, the other team refutes that, and then the first team refutes what the second team said, and so on and so forth. There's none of that, and we would argue that's bad for fairness and maybe also bad for educational value. Reciprocity is this idea that the affirmative team and the negative team should have equal responsibilities and equal rights within a debate round. If the affirmative team isn't allowed to stop defending their plan, why should the negative team be allowed to stop defending their plan? The idea of reciprocity shines there. Now let's talk about critiques. So critiques are this special type of negative argument where they say it's sort of like a non-unique dissent and a counterplan together. They propose an alternative, which is an advocacy, some action they believe should be taken to address some issue within the world. And oftentimes that issue relates to things like epistemology and ontology and stuff like that. So let's talk about some of the common terms when we're dealing with critiques. So epistemology is the idea of like how we come to understand the world, why we come to understand the world in that way, and the legitimacy of understanding the world in a certain way. So, for example, one of the more famous critiques is the anti-blackness critique, which talks about how the world, which talks about understanding the world through the lens of typical epistemology, what we typically try to understand the world through, how we normally think about the world. All of that can be considered anti-black. For example, it's a fundamentally racist notion to look at the world in this way, and in that sense, your epistemology is bad. So epistemology fundamentally comes down to how we think about the world, why we think about the world in that way, and all things to do with that. Ontology is the idea is the study of existence or non-existence. What is the purpose of an object? What is the purpose of its existence? So, for example, the ontology of a chair, one might argue, is for us to sit in. The only reason the chair exists is so that humans can sit down in the chair. Therefore, the only reason for its existence is that. So, ontology, on a broader sense, in a more philosophical sense, can talk about concrete things like chairs, or even non-concrete things like the existence of God, or the existence of ideas, or the existence of philosophy. Now, the last three terms here are some common terms you'll see when you're actually debating a critique. So first is the double bind. So double bind basically is the special type of argument where it's an either or. So consider if you had options A or B, right? And option A and B are somewhat different. If option A is true, and also it's important to note options A and B are the only options you have. If option A is true, then this bad thing happens. If option B is true, then this other bad thing happens. So it's a double bind. No matter what you choose, there's going to be some bad consequence. And normally in the context of debate, that means that no matter what a team chooses to defend, that gives some concession to the other team that they can use to try and derail your argument. So that's essentially what a double bind is. Framework is the idea of whether or not a critique is a legitimate argument. Is it fair to have the negative team present a critique? Is it fair to have an affirmative team present a critical affirmative? And all the theory that goes with that. Finally, we have a KAF. Critiques are normally a negative argument and have been most commonly run as negative arguments, but you do have teams who run critical arguments on the affirmative. Most of the time, they ignore the resolution. They provide their own advocacy that has nothing to do with the resolution, and they argue that the importance of this advocacy is so important that it exceeds the importance of having a resolution to debate about in the first place. And whether or not those AFs are legitimate is once again under framework. So now let's talk about some miscellaneous subjects within debate. So the first thing is judge adaptation. Obviously, it's important to know what are the three broad categorizations for judges. We have the lay judge, who is someone who doesn't have much experience in policy debate or even debate in general. Typically parents, teachers who aren't coaches, staff, volunteers, all of these people could be considered lay judges if they don't have much experience with debate. A flay judge may have some experience or extensive experience with debate, but may not have as much experience with policy debate. So, for example, former PUF debaters, former LD debaters, some coaches, all of these are flay judges. Finally, we have the flow judge. They know what's going on. If you drop every single term of jargon in today's lexicon, in today's lecture, they'll know what you mean. They'll know what you're saying without you having to explain yourself or defining every single word that you use. Oftentimes, these are coaches, these are former policy debaters, these are current college policy debaters. They're in the know about, and they have a lot of knowledge about what policy is and how policy works. The final term I have on here is paradigm. Paradigm refers to the judge's likes and dislikes when it comes to policy debate. So this mostly applies to flow judges, and it basically looks at what types of arguments do they prefer to see in a round, and what types of arguments do they not prefer to see in the round. What interpretation do they believe is true? What interpretation do they not believe is true? So for example, a paradigm might talk about topicality. Maybe a judge says, I like topicality, but I don't like critiques. In that case, a paradigm reveal that would be a paradigm. It tells you what types of arguments a judge prefers and what types of arguments they aren't so they aren't so keen on. Next, let's talk about evidence preparation. So here's some terms that you might encounter when it comes to preparing evidence. So verbatim is the sort of principal thing that we use. It's sort of a macro add-on for Microsoft Word. It's going to be super important for debate. It's specifically tailored for debate and creating evidence. So in terms of the actual evidence itself, there's three main components. We have the tag, which is sort of an overview of what an article says, which is sort of the overview of what an article says. Next to the citation, which talks about which basically is what it is. It's a citation of who wrote the card, when did they write it, all of the pertinent information, so that your opponents, your coaches, your judges can easily find where your evidence comes from. Finally, we have the card. The card is the text of the article or PDF or research paper that you're taking and using as your own. Oftentimes it's highlighted, some of it's dehighlighted, some of it's shrunk, and it's cut in specific ways such that it reads in a specific manner to present the article as supporting evidence to help your argument in a policy debate. The final three cards here are some important terms for just random terms when it comes to evidence. The first is power tagging. Power tagging is when the overview, the tag itself of the piece of evidence over exaggerates what the article actually says. So that's called power tagging. It's usually pretty unethical, and it's pretty easy to tell when someone's power tagging. So for example, maybe they say this leads to nuclear war, and the evidence, the card itself, doesn't talk about nuclear war. Well, that's a pretty clear example of power tagging. Next is reverse causal. This is a type of link. It refers to a type of link that explicitly says this specific policy action or this specific effect will lead to this effect, right? It's reverse causal in that it says not only will, it doesn't just imply a link or an internal link, it explicitly outlines that link or internal link. Finally is clipping cards. This is something that's been kind of common in Eastern Missouri at the very least. It's when you take the card and you don't copy and paste the entire article, or at least the entire relevant parts, or the entire section of the article if it's super long that's relevant to the actual card. So for example, you'll see clipped cards that are like a single sentence, a single paragraph. All of those are clipped cards. There's no context added. It's just the one paragraph that the person chooses because they think that one paragraph is good enough. But this is highly unethical because it's important not only to credit the author of the article that they're citing with the rest of the context of the article itself, but it's also highly unethical in that it's unfair to force your opponents to go look for the article themselves in order to get a better understanding of what the entire context of the stuff that you've highlighted actually says is in the actual card. So finally, I have some miscellaneous terms. Flowing, it's basically the note-taking process of policy debate. Signposting, it's how we indicate where we are, which space of the debate, because there's many arguments to keep track of. So basically, signposting when we're giving speeches is basically letting the judge and our opponents know which argument are we talking about right now. Extending, it's this idea of taking an argument that wasn't contested, there was no refutation, and extending it and explaining it once again in your next speech so that your judge knows that you're extending the argument. That argument is still relevant even though it wasn't refuted in a previous speech. The line by line is another word for the flow. It's basically the meat and potatoes of the debate. It's where we go down the flow and basically go one by one, go through each argument one by one, line by line. Overview, it's a broad, it's sort of a section of the speech where you talk about the broad thesis of your speech. So for example, if you're an affirmative team and you're in the 2AR, your final speech, your overview would be, here's our win condition, here's why we win today's debate. It's a thesis for your speech. An underview is basically after all the meat and potatoes. It talks about why it basically is the same thing as an overview, or in that it explains exactly what your speech said in a different way, and it comes after most of what you said in the speech. Finally, we have cross-examination. Cross-examination just refers to the question and answer period where one person asks the other person questions continuously for 3 minutes, and that's after every single 8-minute speech in policy debate. So I believe that's all the terms I have. I know this is a bit long and this is a long list, but hopefully my explanations of these terms were helpful, and they'll be helpful for you in your high school policy debate career.